Hello. Well, it's funny, isn't it, how ideas tend to converge towards one subject. This morning, I watched a video by that determinedly unvested Styx Hexenhammer, and it put into focus a few thoughts that have been rattling around in my head for a while now as well. Styx was talking about the way new media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and so on, are changing the way the world works. He points out that printing started a social change, but it was restricted because not that many people could read. Then there was the telegraph, which also revolutionised communications, but again, which was restricted because the telegraph required trained operators and specialised equipment. Then there were telecommunications, which again have affected a great change, reaching far more people, but which are strictly controlled by the broadcasters. Now there's the internet and social media, especially social media, which are, as he put it, globalised, not globalism, and which put ideas for social movements into the hands of almost anyone with a mobile phone. Styx points out that the established political parties, which used to be the only channels for debate really, will eventually give way in some fashion to social media because the intelligentsia now have a decreasing role in driving the change or the social discussions. I thought, what am I going to do with that? Because he's right, and somebody else should be talking about that too. Then this afternoon, I tuned into a Tim Pool cast in which he started off talking about the Iran protests and how the imams there are saying that the disturbances are being caused by malicious social media posts from America and other enemies. And that this activity is encouraging impressionable people to get out onto the streets thinking there's a revolution brewing, when in fact nothing's really happening outside a few hackers in some CIA basement. Poole also points out that media can constrict as well as inflame. He brought up the case of a politician who wants to legalise marijuana, but his Facebook posting about it was censored by Facebook, and not by humans, most probably by a robot applying an algorithm. Poole pointed out that the danger of automatic IT is that it can ratchet us into an ever-narrowing pathway of thought. And by the way, Stephen Hawking warned about the same thing a couple of years ago, I think. Both Poole and Styx were talking about the social effects of new media on our future. And I'm now going to invoke Godwin's law by delving into the past and bringing Hitler into the argument. There might be a sociological study about the involvement of radio in the rise of the Nazi Party. I haven't seen it. However, I have considered it. I started thinking about that years ago, because not many people actually consider how new radio was in the 30s, in the 1930s that is. The first regular radio broadcasts were at the end of 1922. That's 8 years before 1930. And that was started by the nascent BBC. For those of you who want to look it up, the station at the time was called 2LO. Radio then started up in Germany in 1923. And pretty soon, over the next 2 years, the entire Western world and Japan had radio stations making regular broadcasts. Of course, what they broadcast had a lot to do with the organisation doing the broadcasting. It might have been a commercial enterprise, mostly that happened in America, or, as with the BBC, it was a public service outfit. But whatever it was a very large and extremely expensive venture with its own drum to bang. Early radios, known as crystal sets, were usually put together out of odd spare parts by the nerds of the time, who spent a lot of their time in their parents' basements fiddling about with soldering irons. And all of the first crystal sets required an earpiece for listening, so the radio was a solitary occupation, like reading a magazine or a book. And the audience was self-limiting and restricted in many cases to a very techie type of audience. That was in the 1920s. But by the early 30s, the first proper modern radios, known as wirelesses, were running on vacuum tubes and had speakers. From then on, listening to the radio was a sit-down family occupation. Broadcasts were usually confined to the evening hours, and the idea was that people would treat the radio like theatre. You'd finish supper, then you'd sit down in a group and be entertained. But how many people watching this have actually thought about how quiet the evenings were in pre-radio days? Think of it. Unless you went to the pub or the music hall, unless you attended a concert or the theatre, the only sounds beyond human speech of your nearest and dearest you would hear of an evening would be if you all got round the harpsichord and had a sing-song. Yeah, many people did do that, but most of the time it would be
very, very quiet.
Even most of the animals would be asleep, and except for the odd sound of dripping water coming through the roof or the rat scurrying about in the skirting, silence would reign. Now, imagine the effect radio would have on a society of people who had spent most of their lives in that sort of silence. Then, the radio, the music, the discussions, the plays, the reports from abroad, the political critique, the propaganda, the messages of hate and imperialism. Think how susceptible most would be to this magic new medium. Then, when you get a charismatic speaker like Adolf Hitler, how would he sweep away the listeners with his messages of a new world order led by his pure race of people who are at present held back only by one group of evildoers? Does that sound familiar? Fortunately, Winston Churchill also understood the power of radio, and his message changed the history that looked just about inevitable. Well, I think that's where we are now. Social media is the new communication, just like radio used to be. And we are at a point where it can develop, inform, and enlighten us, or it can be turned into a monstrous prison of the mind. There are all sorts of authorities that would like to do just that in order to keep a grip on their status quo. In Iran, the government is desperately trying to develop its own social media platform that can be restricted in the same way as the Chinese internet has already been restricted. And the situation is looking increasingly hazardous in the Free West. Germany, for instance, is showing an increasingly heavy hand in silencing critics of its political system. They call it hate speech laws, but don't let that fool you. It has about as much to do with hate speech as a straitjacket has to do with a shirt. It covers the same areas, but for a completely different reason. And it is up to us to decide what we are going to wear.
We're like a big family on the air. Greetings everybody everywhere. Just a little happiness we'll share while we're on the air.